One of the most striking aspects of dealing with a narcissistic personality is how quickly they seem to sense emotional changes in other people, especially when those changes threaten their sense of control. Long before you openly say that you are done with the relationship, something subtle begins to shift inside you. You may start pulling back emotionally. You may stop reacting the way you once did. The endless arguments may no longer trigger the same urgency to defend yourself. Instead of trying to fix things, explain things, or make them understand, you begin to conserve your energy. That internal shift is often quiet, but it is incredibly powerful, and narcissistic individuals are surprisingly sensitive to it. This sensitivity is not rooted in empathy or emotional attunement in the healthy sense. Rather, it comes from their dependence on what psychologists often refer to as emotional supply. They rely heavily on attention, admiration, reactions, and emotional engagement from the people around them. Whether those reactions are positive or negative does not always matter. What matters is that the attention continues to flow and that the relationship dynamic keeps revolving around them. For a long time, they may have been able to provoke you into explaining yourself, defending your character, or trying to repair the relationship. Every one of those reactions keeps you engaged in the dynamic, but the moment you start emotionally detaching, that supply begins to weaken. You may still be physically present, but your energy is different. You respond less, you argue less. You no longer chase resolution after every conflict. Instead of reacting with frustration or sadness, you might respond with calmness or silence. For a narcissistic person, this shift feels deeply unsettling. It signals that the dynamic they have relied on is beginning to collapse. Interestingly, they often recognize this shift even when you have not yet fully processed it yourself. Many people in these relationships reach a stage where they feel exhausted rather than angry. They stop trying to win arguments because they realize that winning never really changes anything. They stop explaining their perspective because it is repeatedly dismissed or twisted. Over time, this emotional exhaustion evolves into detachment. It is not always a dramatic decision. Sometimes it is simply the gradual realization that continuing the cycle is no longer worth the emotional cost. To the narcissistic individual, however, this emotional withdrawal feels like a threat. When someone stops reacting, stops seeking approval, and stops trying to repair the relationship, it disrupts the system of control that has been operating for so long. They may notice that you no longer seem easily provoked. They may sense that their usual tactics, criticism, charm, guilt, or manipulation, are not producing the same emotional response. This creates anxiety for them because the relationship is no longer functioning in a way that protects their ego. At this stage, their behavior often begins to change. Some may suddenly become unusually attentive, almost as if they are trying to pull you back into the emotional intensity of the relationship. Others may become suspicious or accusatory, questioning why you seem distant or different. They might say things like, "You've changed," or "You don't care anymore." While these statements can sound like expressions of concern, they often reflect their recognition that something fundamental is shifting. The irony is that your emotional detachment is not usually about trying to punish them. In many cases, it is simply a survival response. After experiencing repeated cycles of conflict, confusion, and disappointment, people begin to protect themselves by disengaging emotionally. They start creating internal boundaries even before they create external ones. It is the mind and body's way of preserving energy and regaining a sense of personal stability. For the narcissistic person, though, this quiet withdrawal is one of the most threatening signals they can receive. As long as you remain emotionally invested, whether through love, anger, or frustration, they still have influence over the dynamic. But when you begin to emotionally step back, their influence weakens. And because they sense that loss of control, they may start preparing their next move, attempting to pull you back into the familiar cycle. This is why the moment of emotional detachment is so significant. It represents a turning point in the relationship. Even before any final conversation or decision is made, something inside you has already shifted. You begin to see the patterns more clearly. You begin to recognize the manipulation for what it is. And once that awareness starts to grow, it becomes much harder to return to the same level of emotional involvement. In many ways, this quiet moment when you start to emotionally step away is the beginning of reclaiming your sense of self. It may not look dramatic from the outside, but internally it marks the start of breaking free from a dynamic that once felt impossible to escape. And although the narcissistic individual may sense that change quickly, what they cannot easily control anymore is the clarity that is beginning to take root within you. When a narcissistic person begins to sense that they are losing the attention, emotional reactions, or control they once had over someone, it often triggers a powerful response. For them, relationships are not simply about connection or mutual care. Instead, relationships function as a system that maintains their sense of importance, validation, and control. The attention and emotional engagement they receive from others act like fuel for their self-image. When that fuel begins to disappear, it can create a deep sense of threat within them. This is why the loss of attention or control often triggers their strongest and most intense behaviors. As long as you remain engaged, whether through affection, arguments, or attempts to fix the relationship, the narcissistic dynamic continues to operate. Your reactions confirm that they still have influence over you, but when your engagement begins to fade, something changes. The emotional reactions they once relied on start becoming weaker or less frequent. You may stop arguing back. You may stop trying to defend yourself against accusations. You may even stop explaining how their behavior affects you, because you have realized that those conversations rarely lead to meaningful change. To a narcissistic person, this shift feels destabilizing. Their sense of control over the relationship begins to slip, and with it, the reassurance they gain from knowing they can still provoke a response. In that moment, their behavior often becomes more intense, not less. Rather than calmly accepting the change in the dynamic, they may begin escalating their actions in an attempt to restore the previous balance of power. One way this escalation shows up is through increased attempts to provoke emotional reactions. They may suddenly criticize you more harshly, bring up old conflicts, or make comments designed to trigger insecurity. The goal is not necessarily to resolve an issue. Instead, it is to get you to react. Any reaction, anger, frustration, sadness, or even an attempt to explain yourself can reestablish the emotional loop that keeps the dynamic alive. Another common response is a sudden shift toward exaggerated charm or affection. If criticism or conflict fails to get the reaction they want, they may quickly pivot to the opposite approach. They might begin offering compliments, making promises, or acting unusually attentive. To someone who has been hoping for change, this sudden shift can feel hopeful. It may seem like the relationship is finally improving. But in many cases, the timing of this behavior reveals its true purpose. It appears precisely when the narcissistic person senses that your attention is slipping away. Control can also show up through attempts to reassert dominance in the relationship. They may start making demands, issuing ultimatums, or reminding you of past situations where they claim you were dependent on them. These behaviors are often subtle attempts to reinforce the idea that the relationship still revolves around their authority or influence. What makes this stage particularly confusing is that these behaviors can appear contradictory. A narcissistic individual may move rapidly between anger, affection, blame, and vulnerability. One moment they may accuse you of being distant or selfish, and the next moment they may act loving or apologetic. These rapid shifts are not random. They are often attempts to find the tactic that will successfully pull you back into emotional engagement. For someone on the receiving end, this can feel emotionally exhausting. The intensity of the behavior may even make you question your decision to detach or step away. You might wonder if the relationship is worth saving after all, especially when the narcissistic person briefly appears more attentive or concerned. But the underlying pattern often reveals that the behavior is less about genuine growth and more about restoring the previous flow of attention and control. This is why the moment when attention and control begin to fade is such a critical turning point. The stronger the narcissistic response becomes, the more clearly the underlying dynamics tend to reveal themselves. What may have once felt like occasional conflict begins to look more like a cycle of manipulation designed to maintain influence. Understanding this pattern can help bring clarity to a confusing experience. When the strongest manipulative behaviors appear right at the moment you begin stepping away, it is not a coincidence. It is often a reaction to the perceived loss of emotional supply. In many ways, this reaction highlights how much the dynamic depended on your engagement all along. The more you withdraw your attention and reactions, the less stable the system becomes. And while the narcissistic person may escalate their behavior in an attempt to regain control, your growing awareness of the pattern can make it easier to see the situation for what it truly is. Over time, that awareness becomes one of the most powerful tools you have. It helps you recognize that the sudden intensity of their behavior is not evidence that the relationship is improving or deepening. Instead, it often signals that the balance of control is shifting and that your emotional independence is beginning to take hold. One of the most confusing moments in a relationship with a narcissistic person often occurs when you begin to pull away and suddenly they seem to become the person you always hoped they could be. After periods of criticism, emotional distance, manipulation, or conflict, they may unexpectedly return with warmth, kindness, and attention. They may apologize, promise to change, and begin expressing affection in ways that feel deeply reassuring. This sudden shift can feel powerful, almost like the relationship is finally turning into what you always believed it could be. In many cases, this is what is known as love bombing reappearing as a desperate attempt to pull you back. Love bombing typically happens early in a relationship. At the beginning, the narcissistic individual may overwhelm you with praise, attention, gifts, or declarations about how special the connection is. They might say you are unlike anyone they have ever met, that you understand them better than anyone else, or that the relationship is meant to be something extraordinary. In that early stage, the intensity can feel exciting and validating. It creates a strong emotional bond and builds the belief that the relationship is deeply meaningful. Over time, however, that initial intensity often fades. Criticism, manipulation, or emotional distance may slowly take its place. The person who once seemed incredibly attentive may begin to invalidate your feelings, dismiss your concerns, or create cycles of conflict. This shift can leave you confused because you remember how loving they once seemed. You may spend a great deal of time hoping that the caring version of them will return. When you finally begin to emotionally detach or consider leaving, the narcissistic person may sense that something has changed. They may notice that you are no longer chasing their approval, no longer arguing the way you once did, or no longer investing the same level of emotional energy into the relationship. At that moment, the risk of losing control over you becomes very real. This is when love bombing can suddenly reappear. They may start behaving in ways that feel almost magical compared to the tension that existed before. They might become affectionate again, offering compliments and praise that you have not heard in a long time. They may talk about the future, promising that things will be different from now on. Apologies may appear, sometimes delivered with emotional intensity. They might say they realize how much they have hurt you, how much they regret their behavior, and how committed they are to improving. For someone who has been hoping for change, this moment can be incredibly powerful. It may feel like the breakthrough you have been waiting for. After all the confusion and emotional pain, the relationship suddenly seems to show signs of healing. The person who once dismissed your feelings may now appear attentive and understanding. This can make you question whether leaving is the right decision. However, what makes this phase so complicated is that the timing of the affection often reveals its deeper purpose. The sudden return of love bombing tends to occur precisely when you begin stepping away. It is less about genuine transformation and more about preventing the loss of control over the relationship. The affection, attention, and promises are designed to reignite the emotional bond that was beginning to fade. This does not necessarily mean that the narcissistic person is consciously planning every action. In many cases, these behaviors are part of deeply ingrained patterns they use to maintain influence in relationships. When they sense distance, they instinctively shift tactics to regain closeness and emotional engagement. The challenge for the person experiencing this behavior is that the affection can feel real in the moment. The warmth, kindness, and emotional intensity can bring back memories of the early stage of the relationship when everything felt hopeful and exciting. It can make you wonder whether the relationship truly deserves another chance, but over time, many people begin to notice that these cycles repeat. The sudden affection appears when the relationship is at risk, and once stability returns, the old patterns gradually come back. The criticism, manipulation, or emotional distance slowly reemerge. often leaving you feeling as though you have returned to the same place again. Recognizing this pattern is an important step toward clarity. Love bombing in this stage is often less about deep emotional growth and more about restoring the connection that provides attention and control. The kindness may feel convincing, but it is frequently tied to the moment when the narcissistic person fears losing you. Understanding this dynamic can help you look beyond the temporary shift in behavior and focus on the long-term pattern. Real change usually involves consistent effort, accountability, and a willingness to take responsibility for past behavior over time. It does not usually appear suddenly at the exact moment a relationship is about to end. When you begin to see this clearly, it becomes easier to understand why the sudden return of affection can feel so powerful, and why it often appears exactly when you start reclaiming your independence. The love bombing is not simply a romantic gesture. It is often the final attempt to draw you back into a cycle that was beginning to lose its hold on you. As the dynamic in a relationship with a narcissistic individual begins to shift, one of the most noticeable changes is the way manipulation intensifies. When the usual strategies no longer seem to work and the other person starts pulling away emotionally, the narcissistic individual often escalates one of their most powerful tactics, gaslighting. This manipulation becomes stronger and more frequent because its primary goal is to destabilize your sense of reality and make you question your own perceptions. Gaslighting is a psychological tactic in which someone denies or distorts events, conversations, or behaviors in a way that causes the other person to doubt their memory or understanding of what actually happened. In earlier stages of the relationship, this may appear occasionally. A comment might be dismissed with statements like "you're remembering it wrong," or "that never happened." At first, these moments might seem small or confusing, but they gradually begin to erode your confidence in your own perception of events. When you begin to emotionally detach or consider leaving the relationship, gaslighting often intensifies dramatically. The narcissistic individual senses that their usual forms of influence are weakening. You may not react as strongly as you once did, or you may have started setting boundaries that limit their control. In response, they may increase efforts to distort reality in order to pull you back into a state of confusion. For example, they might deny things they clearly said during arguments. If you bring up something hurtful they previously stated, they may insist that you misunderstood or imagined it. They might claim that you are exaggerating the situation or being overly sensitive. The goal is not necessarily to resolve the conflict, but to make you question your own recollection of the event. Another common approach is twisting the narrative of a situation so that you appear to be the one causing problems. If you confront them about disrespectful behavior, they might shift the conversation by accusing you of being critical, controlling, or unfair. Over time, this tactic can make you feel as though every attempt to express your feelings turns into a debate about your character rather than their actions. What makes intensified gaslighting particularly destabilizing is that it often occurs repeatedly and with great confidence. The narcissistic person may present their version of events so firmly that you begin wondering whether you might actually be mistaken. They might repeat their denial multiple times, creating the impression that your perspective is irrational or inaccurate. This repetition can wear down even the most confident individuals. Another element of this tactic is the introduction of doubt about your emotional responses. If you express hurt, frustration, or anger, they may suggest that your feelings are exaggerated or unreasonable. Statements like "you're overreacting," "you're too sensitive," or "you're making something out of nothing" are often used to invalidate your emotional experience. Over time, this can create a situation where you start second, guessing not only your memory but also your feelings. This stage can feel incredibly confusing because the more you try to clarify the truth, the more tangled the conversation becomes. You may find yourself explaining the same situation over and over, hoping that if you present the facts clearly enough, the other person will finally acknowledge them. Unfortunately, in a narcissistic dynamic, these conversations rarely lead to genuine understanding because the objective is not mutual clarity. The objective is maintaining control over the narrative. As gaslighting intensifies, it can also create emotional exhaustion. Constantly defending your memory and perception takes a significant amount of mental energy, Over time, some people begin to withdraw from these arguments simply because they feel pointless. This withdrawal is often interpreted by the narcissistic individual as a sign that their tactic is working, reinforcing the pattern even further. However, something important often begins to happen when someone reaches the point of emotional detachment. Instead of becoming more confused, they may start recognizing the pattern itself. They begin noticing that certain conversations follow the same predictable path: denial, blame shifting, and invalidation. Once this pattern becomes visible, it becomes harder for the manipulation to have the same impact. Recognizing intensified gaslighting is often a crucial moment of clarity. It reveals that the issue is not simply a misunderstanding or a communication problem. Instead, it highlights a consistent strategy used to protect the narcissistic individual from accountability. By denying reality and shifting blame, they avoid confronting their own behavior while keeping the other person trapped in confusion. As this realization grows, many people begin trusting their own perceptions again. They start recognizing that their memory of events is not the problem. They see that the repeated distortion of reality is part of a broader pattern of manipulation designed to maintain influence over the relationship. This awareness can be incredibly empowering. When you understand that the confusion is being deliberately created, it becomes easier to step back from the arguments. Instead of trying to prove your reality in every conversation, you begin to see that clarity does not require their agreement. And once you stop participating in the endless cycle of defending your perception, the power of gaslighting begins to weaken significantly.